You're listening to the Ask Drone U podcast. You ask, we answer your drone questions. Whether you're here to turn your passion into profit or you simply fly for fun, we're a community of learners and teachers who aspire to achieve greatness. We are
Drone U.
Hey everyone, welcome to another fantastic day and another fantastic episode of Ask Drone U. My name is Pablo.
Indeed it is, Pablo. My name is Rob. And this is episode 985. I almost said 984, but it's not. It's 985. And we are inching ever closer to 1,000, which we're very excited by because that means that we hope, we think we're bringing some value and you guys continue to listen. We really appreciate that. That's really important to us. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. We do appreciate that. We also appreciate the opportunity to help more people out. And if you could help us help more people and be a part of the greater good, we would greatly appreciate that. If you could share the show or maybe leave us a review wherever you listen, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever. But today's show won't get me up as fired up as you all were hoping for.
In fact, it might put him to sleep.
Actually, I am planning on uploading an article to the site while we do this show. So,
Oh, gosh. I don't think you're supposed to admit that.
Well, there's that. Anyway, no, today's show is about business, but it actually is about a very important question about if you are, let's say you're rocking the side hustle, right? You got a full-time gig, but you're on your way out. You're like in the senior year of your full-time gig. Maybe it's year 18 or year 19, and you're starting to think about the future. What is there to do? What can you do? Well, here to talk about all that and some more is Mr. Rob Burdick,
Some more.
a.k.a. my co-host.
Or less.
But it's actually an interesting question because, you know, we're all running businesses, and whether you're running a side hustle or full-time gig, how you set up your financial structure is extremely important. And we are here today to hopefully help that position out. So, Rob, why don't you go ahead and play this question, which actually is a direct result, if I may, of the new Drone U business course. So I don't know if you've heard of this asshat, but there's a guy named the Drone Boss, and I call him that for a reason. But anyway, long story short, he's been blacklisted from pretty much every drone group on Facebook.
Oh, is that right?
So this is not something new. But he will invite you to a weekend-long course to learn to do a drone business, and you'll pay thousands of dollars. Or you could just take these 36-hour-long class that's on the Drone U website, which I can tell you is actually taught from extreme experience, as Mr. Rob Burdick over here has been a business owner since I moved to my parents' house. Pretty much the same time frame.
So you're aging me. But this was a team effort, and we all kind of put in our expertise and our experiences into this class, which is what I think makes it great.
I do too. In fact, there's a lot of information that I had to like look over and be like, wait a minute, I didn't know that. So.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is I think there's still tons more that we could add to it, which we will, and we'll be updating. It's sort of we'll call it a dynamic class, right? As most are, because things are changing so quickly. But even in the business aspects of what we're all doing, it's changing quickly.
It makes me wonder how many members actually knew that we had a business course on the site available to watch. If you're a current member and you haven't watched that site and you're like, where's some of this new Drone U content? We've actually been dropping loads of new content regularly, finally.
Yeah.
And the business course is one of those pieces. So if you haven't checked it out in regards to today's question, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you check it out. And then if anyone who's ever listening to this is just like, I wonder if Drone U is really worth $47 a month. Well, when other people are getting shammed out of thousands with bad information, and we actually care about people, which is why we give it up for the price that we do, because we want people to succeed. We want to build people up to a bridge that they can continue building themselves to a life of success. We're not here to take you off the bridge.
Yeah.
And literally like pull blocks away from it. And by blocks, I mean physical dollars. Okay. So anyway, there was my metaphor for the day.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and hear the question.
Well, I do want to add just one last quick thing about the business class and determining whether it would bring enough value to you. One easy way to do that. Number one, at least at the time of this recording, you can still get a 14-day trial for $1, right? So go to thedroneu.education and you can learn all about that. But if you just get into the business class and then you look at the table of contents, you can see the categories that are interesting to you. Then you can get into any of the videos that might be interesting to you. And then from there, you can see where they've been tagged by time and really get into the details of what each of those videos has, right? They've been timestamped. So you're going to see just by doing that, the depth of material in there, and there's going to be a lot more to come. So really excited about that class and really excited about it being a organic thing that's going to be changing in the future. So, all right, let's play the question.
Hello, Paul and Rob. This is Scott from Denver, Colorado, and I'm calling about something that Rob mentioned in the business class about a sole proprietorship LLC and the fact that you need to keep them very split up. So if you're not necessarily making money and this is kind of a side hustle, are you able to just transfer money into that sole proprietor LLC bank account? And they look at it as that's business and your personal is your personal. Or, I mean, if you can't start with revenue, it needs to come from somewhere, right? So it's got to come from personal. This might seem obvious and might be a question for taxing, but thought I'd ask. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Do appreciate the question. Thank you for being a multiple question asker. This is 2 in a row from you, which is always exciting for us. And I do think that this is a question that a lot of people have, especially folks that have been in the business course and have experienced what you experienced. And I wouldn't say it's obvious at all. I think any of this information is not to be considered obvious. Hence the class, right? So let's go a little bit deeper before we actually answer your specific question, which is a good one. What we're talking about here, just to clarify terms, is something called a disregarded entity. And so backing up even from there, you mentioned this being a side hustle. I don't think the fact that it's a side hustle should speak too significantly to whether or not you protect yourself in terms of liability, right? Now, if it's more of a hobby, I mean, there is a threshold and that's going to be different for everybody in terms of when you should take the time and effort and money. Not that it can be that expensive, it doesn't need to be, to set up an entity to protect yourself. But what we're talking about here and what the business class is talking about in that particular instance is a person who sets up a limited liability company for all the reasons that we discussed in the class, primarily to protect yourself from a liability standpoint. And also from a taxing standpoint, you're going to have more flexibility and more options in terms of optimizing your tax situation is how I'll put that. So I think that threshold might be, at least in my estimation, a little bit lower than most of you might think as to when you would go about getting an LLC set up. But if you're a person who sets up an LLC and you are the only member of that LLC, so you have 100% of the membership interest in that LLC, that's when it could potentially be a disregarded entity, which means the IRS doesn't actually recognize it as a separate entity. Not necessarily a big deal, but one way that you can have it recognized as a full entity by the IRS if you are the only member is if you ask that it be treated and taxed as a corporation. Probably something for the class or for another completely separate podcast. But when you get into that situation and it is a disregarded entity, now all you're doing is you're reporting it on your tax return like on the Schedule C, which is not very similar. It is actually the same as if you were just a sole proprietor. And I say just because that means you did not set up an entity. All right, with all of that out of the way, the next piece of this that we want to make sure is really, really clear is that the reason that's stated in the class, and that I tend to mention this frequently when business matters come up, you really want to keep your personal expenses and just flow of money separate from your business expenses and flow of money, because what you're doing when you combine those and when you co-mingle those funds is the term that we use, you're making it really, really difficult for the IRS, in the event there's ever an audit, to come in and clearly distinguish your business activity from your personal activity. That's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to make them err, if you will, on the side of calling things personal activities. Not what you want, right? Number 2, it could actually cause them to essentially ignore the fact that you have, or from a legal perspective, ignore the fact that you have an entity set up, which you've set up to protect yourself. And let's say you crash a drone and you damage somebody's property, or you hurt somebody, and let's say that you don't have enough insurance, or you don't have insurance. Please don't be that person. But let's just say you don't, or let's say it causes more damage than you ever imagined it could, and you've got $1 million policy and the damage is $1.5 million. Work with me here on the numbers. And now you have co-mingled funds, right? So you've been using personal and business stuff all together. The lawyers are going to come in and they're going to do something known as pierce the corporate veil. So that protection can be pierced in the legal system simply because of how you've managed your money. There are other ways that can happen, but that's a real easy one to take care of. So there's the background. That's what we're talking about there. Your specific question is to suggest, well, how do I get money into my company if I can't commingle funds? But what you're asking about doing is not commingling funds. It's funding your company, and it's perfectly okay. I mean, obviously, like you said, you're not going to start day one with enough revenue to run your business, although I suppose it's possible if you don't set it up until you have that revenue set up. But in most cases, that's not going to be what happens. And so essentially, you putting money from your personal bank account, transferring it over into your business account, is no different than somebody who invests in your company transferring money from their bank account, whether it's personal or business, into your business account. The key is to make sure that you have an audit trail, and that can be documented where the money originated, and then also how is it accounted for on the books of your business. And I'll leave that for your accountant to deal with, because there are various ways that that can happen. We'll call it 2, just for sake of you asking your CPA. It can be debt or it can be equity. Those are kind of the simple things to look at. So anyways, that's all of that in a nutshell. You're going to be fine doing it that way. In fact, that's how most businesses are started. That's how ours was started, is us putting personal money into the bank account of Drone U so we can get things rolling. So you're on track. Go ahead and do that if you haven't already, and you're going to be just fine. So thank you for the question. Really, I just love talking about this stuff.
Is there anywhere where people can go to actually get written out information like from the IRS? Because it's one of those things that's really, really interesting, because there's so much information out there, like as far as books are concerned, on, you know, like what the IRS says versus what the IRS does. Like even that, what's her name? Sandy Boykin, Sandy something. She wrote that book about like learning about, you know, taxes and the tax systems, and essentially explains that there's 2 tax systems, and most Americans, even in the media, they only talk about one. It's really funny, because if you actually think of the media in regards to how they report on the tax system, it literally represents a perfect analogy of everything that's wrong with the media as a whole. They only show you one side, and there's 2 tax systems, so why don't they talk about that? So, for example, is there anywhere where we can get good information, or do you have a reliable source where, you know, you think where there could be a good resource?
Well, I don't think you're going to like my answer.
Well, I don't have to like your answer. How many times do you not like my answer?
and vice versa. So
I don't like your answer.
For me, and this probably isn't fair, that I think the answer to the question is from the horse's mouth, and that is in the code, right? So you can go to irs.gov and get a lot of information. But number 2 is having a good person that you trust.
CPA.
A CPA that you can ask questions and that you can sit down with, particularly when you're starting your business, that you can sit down with maybe even quarterly. And, you know, they are out there. I kind of prefer the smaller office type CPA. I just think they're going to be more fair, and particularly they're going to be more inclined to work with a small business like you. Some of the larger firms, they're more interested in the $50,000 to, you know, $2 million a year clients. But, you know, other than that, it's going to be difficult to give you one source to go to. I think there's a lot of good information online. There are a lot of CPAs writing articles online and so forth, and certainly you can go to those. But even with that kind of information, you're going to want to double check. I think one thing that you can do along those lines is maybe look at 2 or 3 sources, and if you're seeing some consistency in those answers and they're being written by CPAs whose firms you can verify. For example, someone's going to write an article, I'm so-and-so CPA from so-and-so town. You can go look up that particular person's website and see that they're a legitimate person. And so if you want to go through that effort, you can do it that way. But otherwise, Paul, I think it's generally going to come down to me doing my research in that sense, looking at irs.gov and talking to my CPA if I have any questions. And, that sort of two-system thing that you're talking about, some of that's sort of theoretical. And
I just mean that there are two systems in regards to you're either employed or you're not. And you either pay employment taxes or you don't.
Gotcha.
So there's self-employment and then there's being employed.
Absolutely.
And Sandy Boykin talks about this. She's like, you're either a W-2 or you're a W-4. And if you've never heard of the W-4, then you've been losing lots of money.
Absolutely. And so, it starts to get pretty deep here. And we do go into this in the class. And we actually have our CPA, who I've known for 20 years, in the class helping us talk through some of this information.
I think we need a freaking therapist for the business class too. No, do you know how many people I've actually told, like, oh, you work for someone? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, but you start a side business? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, but you don't own an LLC. And they're like, well, I'm getting one. And I'm like, well, as soon as you get one, you need to go to your employer and hand them a W-4. And they're like, well, why would I do that? And I'm like, because you don't want your taxes withheld on W-2, because now you can run things through your small business. And Sandy, obviously that there are very specific ways to go about this in order for compliance. So please don't take everything that I say as like the gold standard. You need to go out and research this information on your own. But in addition to that, I mean, you got to understand too, my point in saying this is, whenever I tell people to go do that, they're like, oh, Paul, well, what if my CPA doesn't like that and they don't want to change the way that I'm paid? Or what if that upsets my employer? Or, I'm really nervous that my manager, I don't care. You know why I don't care? Because on irs.gov, it says if you hand that person a W-4, it is actually illegal for them to not accept it. It's in the book. The book's right outside. I read it every year pretty much.
Okay.
Anyway, my point is that the reason I say that there should be a psychologist or a counselor on board with the business course is that people's ideological mindset of how society works, how they are supposed to work in society, and how they are supposed to do things as a whole is completely flawed. It's flawed because people have built up their environment mentally, and they don't understand unless they're given other information, which you would think that education kills fear, right? It doesn't. People have to literally go out and see it for themselves. When I read it and it was written by an IRS employee that said that, I was like, man, I'm going to show this to Sarah. She needs to go do this herself. Refuse to do it. Absolutely refuse to do it.
Not even have a conversation.
Will not even talk to the person.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any harm in having that conversation. Number one, I love that you always bring up things that the majority of people aren't thinking about or considering. So that's a beautiful thing.
I think that's my purpose in the world.
Well, you're fulfilling your purpose.
In many ways with you that other people have no idea about as well.
I actually believe that is very important, that we are all questioning the status quo, right? That's essentially right. That's essentially what you're doing. But, and so I wouldn't even disagree that one can go have that conversation with their employer. But what I can tell you is that there are other factors that are significant factors that are probably going to cause your employer to tell you to
pound sand.
Well, maybe just get back to work. And so if your job's pounding sand, yes, they're going to ask you to pound sand.
He's actually tampering
yeah,
down
he might be
sand.
operating a tamper. Anyway. That'd be funny.
Son, you need to go back outside and pound that sand.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
This actually brings up a quick point. You said, you've always got to be questioning the status quo. I actually read an article from, I want to say it was like the Educator's Blog or something. Because, as an instructor, there are things that I go through that I want to know, is it normal or not? And one of the things is there's always that guy in class. Do you know what I mean? There's always that one guy, right?
Questions everything.
Questions everything.
Usually irrationally and illogically.
something. Yes. And as a teacher, you have to be able to like draw that person and their intellectual curiosity back to the point so that you can continue teaching for everyone else as well. Well, I learned in this article that those people are typically the people that question the status quo the most, and that those particular students are actually the most, how do I say this? They're the most prone for extreme success or extreme failure. Because a teacher can either shut them down completely, they lose all motivation and inspiration to learn, and they kind of just flutter out. That happens a lot. In other cases where
It's our school system.
Exactly. In other cases where kids are learned to question things, but question very directly and think about the type of questions that they're thinking about and how do I, evolve that question. Those students are actually, I forget the exact statistics that were used in the article, but are like something like 8 to 15 times more successful than all the other students just because they question the status quo, and those questions lead them to more information and education, and those questions lead to more educated decisions, which means better life as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, I definitely encourage my kiddos to question the status quo respectfully, right?
There's a very key point in that, in respectfully, and I feel like that's something that I'm still learning to this day, is respectfully questioning the status quo. Because, it's, anyway.
Yeah, you don't want to do it pompously, for example. But anyways, to get back to the point about going to your employer with a W-4 and saying, here you go, and you better do it, there is the Department of Labor, and there are very strict rules about who's considered self-employed in 1099 versus W-2. And so, while
1099 is different from W-4, though.
Well,
it says it in the book, too. Talks about it very specifically.
I guess I'm stumped. We'll have to talk more about that. So you're just talking about how their withholding is handled?
It's how their withholding is handled. So don't forget, if they're not getting withhold anything, they're paying a lot of taxes at the end of the year, right?
No,
but they can also write more off against those taxes, which fundamentally changes the tax bracket that they're in.
Okay, let's clarify. The W-4 simply tells them how do you want your W-2 to work. The W-4 is just the form you give the employer to say, this is how I want my withholding to work.
Yes.
Okay. So what let me ask you this.
We should
I
just go get
assumed
the
way that you were talking about it, I assume you were talking about being a 1099 employee versus a W-2 employee, because the W-4 is just the mechanism for telling your employer, this is how I want my withholding to work. Right?
This goes to show your much more significant knowledge on the subject.
Well, so I just kind of was looking past that and thinking that you were talking about being a 1099 employee, which is a whole different...
Well, I hadn't gone that far into the argument yet, at least intellectually speaking. Also, as far as physical or metaphysical communication is concerned.
So there must be some element of the W-4 that she is saying that people should utilize and they're not.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a different point.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
This is why you teach business, not me. Now I don't even have to explain why he is the subject matter expert. Rob, thank you for being on the show.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, man.
Goodness. Anyways, I think and I hope that answers Scott's question. I think we'll stop it there, and we might leave some people hanging as to the W-4 thing, and maybe we'll get into that later in terms of what you're talking about from that book, but I don't think this is the time for that.
It is not the time. This is also why the business class is so lengthy, because they go down all the rabbit holes and all the things that you should be considering.
There's a lot more we could go down, but at some point we will, because they're valuable rabbit holes.
That they are.
All right.
On that bombshell, that's going to do it for us today. My name is Paul.
My name's Rob.
This is Ask Dronia.